Why Don't You Like Me? Chapter 1. My First Period. I've been doing this N64 stuff for a long time now, well, coming up to over a decade in fact, and most of the time I read comments on YouTube or messages over on the Facebook page, or sometimes even on Instagram. People are often talking about the same games over and over. Look, I'm in the crowd that thinks there's no such thing as a hidden gem. That phrase alone just makes me cringe anytime I see it in a video title. It's so overplayed, and come on, you have the internet so nothing is hidden anymore. But I digress. There are however some really fun games which I enjoy that nobody seems to ever talk about, and so for today's video, here's 5 Nintendo 64 games which I never seem to hear anyone say that they love. As always, if you want a full review of any of today's games, then head on down to the description box where I'll link you up to individual reviews for them. And for today's topic of conversation in the comments section, I want to hear any game from any system that you enjoy that nobody else seems to ever mention. Who knows, you could help someone find their next hidden gem. Ugh. Sorry, I think I just got a bit of vomit in my throat. Star Soldier Vanishing Earth is a 1998 space shoot-'em-up developed and published by Hudson. Like the name suggests, this game falls into the Star Soldier series of games. The series seemed to be completely dead after 1992's Soldier Blade on the TurboGrafx, and so when Hudson announced they were developing a new entry in the series, it came as a bit of a surprise to many. In the year 2092, humanity is threatened at the hands of creatures known as the Zeograd. Not going down without a fight, the Special Inception Air Force unleashes the F-92 Soldier Blade, who basically kick their ass. Now 6 years later, the battle continues, and using the information obtained from the last victory, the Special Inception Air Force creates 3 new spacecraft called the F-98 series of ships to defend humanity once again. So look, the storyline here is pretty much a rehash of the last game, but it's also nice to see that Hudson actually linked this game to the last in the series, so that fans did get a little bit of fan service here. The 3 new craft you get to see and play as all play completely differently. And so not only does it add replayability to the game, it introduces the rolling manoeuvre, which is a defensive move that deflects enemy attacks. This adds a level of tactical skill to the gameplay, and for anyone going for high scores, which, let's be honest, these types of games are all about, then you'll definitely need to master both attacking and defensive manoeuvres to take down many of the 35 different enemy types in the game. Speaking of enemies, they're each named after different types of bladed weapons, which is a nice nod back to the Star Soldier Blade name. Back to Star Soldier however, there are 7 stages here, each with their own massive boss battles at the end, which I think are all superb. Throughout the story campaign there are a handful of bonus levels also, and some of these have both a mid-mission boss as well as the final boss to pack in some real challenge. In addition to this, the game also has quick 2-minute and 5-minute caravan modes, again with their own mid-level and ending bosses for those who are perhaps a bit strapped for time or just prefer timed games to help gather high scores in. So why don't I think Star Soldier Vanishing Earth gets talked about much? Well, for a start, it's probably the only shoot-'em-up anyone ever played in the West on the N64, so having no direct competition means it's kind of your only choice for this genre. You can get into countless debates with people about the console's best FPS game or the best platformer, but apart from the Japanese exclusive Daismon 3D, you're kind of finished on the console when it comes to shoot-'em-ups. The 16-bit era was in my opinion the heyday for this type of game, and in a world where everything was being pushed into 3D, and anything that clung on to the past would get critically panned most of the time, it was a game which can be appreciated now, but when it was first released it would be hard to justify dropping so much money on the game for what is essentially a few short levels and a game based around a high score system rather than an epic world to explore or play through. I love the graphics here, the soundtrack by Shimakura is great, and this is easily a game which I think everyone should own as it's a blast from the past and it's just a great single player experience. In the same way that Star Soldier a moment ago was an N64 game based on what I would say was a 16-bit era genre, Fighting Force 64 is another example of a game which was trying to drag a 16-bit fan favourite genre into the modern day. Look, everyone wanted Streets of Rage 4 back then. Every time it was teased, or another 3D beat 'em up would get released, it would always be compared to Streets of Rage from the Genesis era. And look, I get that. Streets of Rage 1 and 2 are two of my favourite Mega Drive games from my childhood, and I've countless memories of playing them in co-op with my brother, which was something we always loved about these types of games. But when Fighting Force was released on PlayStation in 1997, nobody could seem to move on from this comparison, and so Fighting Force was met with mixed reviews. Surprisingly to pretty much everyone, in 1999 Core Design released their only Nintendo 64 game. This made N64 fanboys like myself quite annoyed, as Tomb Raider 64 had been teased for so damn long, and considering that Fighting Force 2 was already being released in 1999, we were at least hoping that the N64 version would be both games merged into one, or perhaps a director's cut type version with the best of Fighting Force 1 as well as some of the levels from Fighting Force 2 all merged into one. But note, we got Fighting Force 1, renamed as Fighting Force 64, and aside from slightly improved graphics and some under the hood tweaks to options, this was a game which not many people really wanted aside from those of us who'd been longing for a game of this genre. Watching the gameplay here, you know what to expect. You pick one of 4 characters and work your way through various stages, across different scenery, basically taking out anything with a pulse. There's weapons to pick up, environments to destroy, which was a nice touch, and controls so easy that even your grandma could probably join in and play co-op with you and pull in a good shift. And yes, of course it has a elevator level, because why the hell not? The game's as formulaic as they come, but I don't think that's a bad thing here. I think back in the day we were all hoping for something that really wasn't going to be possible with this genre until years later. But what we got here was a solid, albeit uninspired 3D street brawler, which we could play with our mates. It's a game which you can switch off, mash a few buttons and relax to. You don't need to remember intricate controls, a complex storyline plot, or even what the hell you're doing. Just bash anything that moves and move on to the next area. It's a fun game that you'll play once to completion and you'll never need to go back to it again unless you're doing it again to play in co-op with a friend. It's cheap to pick up, relaxing to play, and when you're done, go back to playing Streets of Rage 4 because that's bloody brilliant. When you've created one of the greatest kart racing games of all time in Diddy Kong Racing, everyone of course wanted a follow-up to this classic. So Rare had to make a game with the Disney license instead, and this is a game project which was mostly handled by new team members. They churned out Mickey Speedway USA. It's a game which got okay reviews, but universally it was met with a bit of a meh attitude. It doesn't dethrone Mario Kart 64 as the best multiplayer kart racer, and it doesn't tackle Diddy Kong Racing's crown as the better single player game. Mickey Speedway USA at first glance doesn't seem to know what type of game it wants to be. That, however, is where the problem with the game started. Anyone picking up the game was met with menus which are confusing to navigate, characters who talk way too much when racing, and a game which has weapons and items but doesn't seem too pushy in needing you to actually use them. You need to give this one time, however, because once you get past the initial disappointment, you start to see what is a well-crafted game here, and one which I'm surprised people are not playing more often. Firstly, the game runs at 60 FPS, which for an N64 game is a rarity. And yes, I know F-Zero X did it years before, but if you compare the graphics of the two games, definitely tell me this one is more impressive. And before you start commenting saying the game looks to be running slow, look, I'm playing on the medium speed here because on the equivalent of the 150cc speed, I get spanked left, right and centre by the other drivers, and of course I can't lose my credibility here. But moving on, the track designs are superb, and whilst yes, I personally would have preferred it if they used Disney locations, I actually think the USA based tracks gave them a lot of scope to create some cool ideas. Take Las Vegas for example. The track combines everything from canyons to casinos, and so visually it's as much fun to look at as it is to play. The handling too is also perfect. The game shines in its time trials mode, and power sliding is a skill which you must master here, very much in line with Mario Kart 64. The storyline doesn't feature an open world hub like DKR, but the storyline here is your typical Disney fodder. A disappointment in the game being the secret characters, which I won't spoil for you, but let's just say it's not really worth the effort. What I find most interesting here though is how un-Rare-like this game feels. Typically when you play any of the other N64 games made by Rare, they all have a very similar look, feel and sound to them. I appreciate this was a game by the newbies at the company at the time, but in a way it's almost refreshingly different. The soundtrack too is superb most of the time, and there are some pieces of music here which are up there with Rare's classics. So why don't I think that people like this game as much as they should? Well, I think in this instance there's two games in the same genre on the N64 that to this day and age are still regarded as all-time greats. It also got the curse of being a later N64 title, and reviews didn't exactly call this one a must-own title. It still remains Rare's dirty little secret on the console, and whenever I mention it to casual fans, sometimes they just don't even realise this game was made by Rare. Worms is one of those games which I'd be surprised if anyone watching hasn't played at some point on some system. My first dose of Worms came in the summer of 1995 after a dodgy barbecue. But it was the same summer when my dad got home with Worms on PC, and after faffing around installing it, we finally got to play this weird looking game I'd never seen before. Instantly my brother and I were hooked on it. We would create our own teams, take them to war, play with all of the weird and wonderful weapons, and enjoy this tactical and yet action-packed clever little game. As the series grew, it expanded out onto consoles with Worms Armageddon, and that's where I feel it started to become more mainstream due to the larger install base of gamers on consoles now available to them. Developed by Team 17, who are just down the road from me, and published by Hasbro on Nintendo 64 in the year 2000, Worms Armageddon is a game which I think nobody has much love for because of how damn hard it was to get hold of anywhere. Now the game was popular in Europe, and so here in PAL regions this one wasn't too difficult to find in stores, but there would never be multiple copies in my day. In North America however, the game is one of the hardest and rarest N64 games to find, especially if you are looking for a complete in the box copy. The game itself however is damn fun and takes the best parts of the PC game and has a special bonus over the other console ports on other systems, in that being kart based there are no loading times. I know on PlayStation especially the loading times were a drag because at some point in the past I had the game on my PlayStation 2 and I ended up quitting playing it just to go back to the other versions. Do you want to know something really cool? The game on PC is still being updated even to this day. Well okay, the last update was in 2020, but for a game which is so old but also so loved, it's great to see a studio still care about it. So look, it's a turn-based action strategy game, but on Nintendo 64 it shines. Plug in controllers or just pass a controller between yourself and friends. You can set up a match with as many mates and play a strategic deathmatch. You can all gang up on one person or play fairly and spread the carnage. The weapons and items at your disposal range from awesome to downright hilarious like skunks, and the scenery is also destructible, meaning that no game is ever the same. The game also has the ability to randomly generate new battlegrounds, making the possibilities endless with this one. There's a training mode for any newbies, a mission mode for any solo players wanting to test their skills, and a quick start mode which can have you going from turning on your N64 to actually playing a game in less than 1 minute, which is the only console you're likely to be able to do this on. I love Team 17, and so it's not just because I'm repping the Yorkshire Mafia here, and so this game, to end up on this list, well, it's just an all-time classic. So why don't I think the N64 version gets much love? Well, hardly anyone out there would have been able to play it back in the day, so there won't be really much nostalgia for this on N64. I also think that the PlayStation was rife with pirating issues, and so for a niche game like this, if you had the choice between dropping £50 for the N64 version or £3 for a pirated PlayStation copy, I know what many kids would have chosen to do. In the present day though, this one's super expensive in the States, and even in PAL regions the prices are getting a little bit silly, and so fire this one up on your EverDrive and perhaps give yourself a taste for Worms. As many of you will know, I love racing games and have a guilty pleasure for those trashy arcade ones from the 90s. I love the Cruisin' series of games, and so when Midway bought Offroad Challenge to the Nintendo 64, for me it was a take my money moment. Although the arcade original was developed by Midway, the N64 version fell to Avalanche Software, who prior to this worked on Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero. But don't let that put you off however, because as far as this game goes, they have tried to replicate the arcade experience, and for the best part I think they succeeded. They added some unlockable tracks and a circuit mode, but as a rule of thumb this game is set up for you to do a serious amount of grinding in. You start off choosing your truck and you start with 0 stats. You earn money for placing in races or picking up cash along the way, and you'll use these to buy upgrades. The upgrades are insanely expensive though, and so you'll find that you're doing races over and over again trying to hit those gold boxes to give you any chance of finishing higher up in the rankings by upgrading your truck. It's a trashy game with horrible visuals, tons of pop-up, fogging in multiple places, and sound which is very rough around the edges. And yet I still love it. The races themselves are just utter carnage with crashes and explosions all over the place. The track designs are unique and varied, and one minute you can go from a wilderness setting to the next minute being on a snowy mountain. It makes no sense whatsoever, and that's where this game's charm comes in. Look, everyone loves a fillet steak, but if that's all you had day after day, you'd soon start craving a Five Guys burger dripping with cheese, and that, my friends, is like Offroad Challenge. It's a dirty great cheeseburger in a time when everyone kept asking for fillet steak, and anything that wasn't top grade bovine would get trashed in magazine reviews. This game scored horribly. It was overpriced considering they charged more for it than they did with Cruis'n USA years earlier, and it only supported 2 players, when clearly with a little more effort they could have at least got 4 players in this game working. The arcade cabinet supported up to 4 machines being linked up, so why the heck couldn't they do it with the N64? I don't know. You should like this game, seriously. If you like the pick up and play then switch off your mind type games like the Cruis'n series I mentioned before, then this game will be for you. It's dirt cheap to pick up now, you can easily kill a day playing with it and trying to max out your truck stats, and when you're done you can go get on with playing Cruis'n Blast because man, that game looks nuts. As always though, thank you for watching, and until next time.